Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of RM Sotheby's Car Show. And you are watching me or listening to me from a bunker, a vast bunker in the middle of Paris, and somewhere up there is the Mona Lisa hanging on a wall because we are underneath the Louvre. It's an amazing location and we've got about 100 cars, just under, but an incredible collection that are going to be going under the hammer in a couple of hours from now. And in this episode, what we've decided to do is take a slightly different tack. We had the opportunity to catch up with Jonny Fowle. He's the whisky expert, the head of whisky for Sotheby's. And what's really interesting is that there is quite a lot of synergy between whisky making and whisky manufacturers and the automotive world. And we chatted through some of that. You'll be spectacularly amazed by some of the prices that whisky commands. And I think you'll learn more about whisky in this episode, if you didn't know anything beforehand, than you probably learned in the last few years. It's really, really interesting, so please tune in, and thanks for joining us. Now we're at a car auction, we're in Paris, we're surrounded by cars. We're in a kind of a little enclave in the middle of the hall here, which is a Sotheby's enclave rather than an RM Sotheby's enclave, and we've got watches and we've got all sorts of things like that.
You can't keep your eye off the handbags though, can you?
I like a handbag. I do like a handbag on the right, day of the week, Sundays. But watches we've talked about a bit on this podcast because there are watch brands that have really aligned themselves with the car world. It could be motor racing, or it could be just working with car brands, and there's a huge crossover between people that love watches and the people that love cars. And in fact, if you pick up a car magazine, they don't often tackle a topic that is not car related, but they will quite often devote 2 or 3 pages to watches. But although we can't talk about any kind of mechanical nature to whisky, there is nevertheless kind of a bit of a synergy between the car world and alcohol, but in particular whisky.
Yeah, I mean, so whisky right now, you're seeing this sort of generation of high value whiskies. So we're talking £100,000 or $100,000 plus. And in this area of the market, you're seeing quite a lot of car and whisky crossovers. The perfect example, I guess, for us, in fact, the first one that we ever worked on was with Bowmore and Aston Martin. There will be another one this year in 2023, but we sold a bottle of, it's called the Bowmore DB5. And it was an old, it's called Black Bowmore. It's an old liquid that was released in 1995. It was the third release of the Black Bowmore. They rebottled it, and they went through this agency called Burgess Studios, who they were involved in how do you put together a car and whiskey collaboration. And when they went to the Aston factory, they found these old DB5 pistons. And they repurposed the DB5 piston, so they molded the glass onto the piston and they filled from the top. So the bottle is half glass, half piston, and that was your first Aston Martin and Bowmore crossover.
You aware of that?
No, first I've heard of that.
It's very cool. Yeah, we
It's
sold
really
one. They go for about 100,000 USD, maybe just a little bit over now.
You couldn't use the piston out of one of your cars. They've all got holes in, haven't they? For your racing endeavours.
They're leaking out. So. How many did they make?
How many bottles did they make?
Good question. I think it was 60.
Okay.
But it was, so the Black Bowmore, originally there were 3,000 of them back in 1995. But a lot have been drunk since then, so there's not too many. And they used the bottles that they had in the archive, so they probably had about, maybe 80 bottles in the archive, and they took 60 and they used it for this purpose.
I guess there's not an easy answer to that, but I mean, where do you think the market is for one of those? I mean, do you think that that's just a die-hard whiskey collector that's after a very rare bottle, or are you selling them to people that are like die-hard Aston Martin fans, or where do you think the market is? It could be any of those, I guess.
I think generally these do tend to sell, I mean, particularly when we sell in the secondary market or via auction, they tend to sell to people who like whiskey anyway. So we find that any whiskey collaboration with another category, it benefits the brand in terms of the exposure it gets, because you tend to get broader press coverage because you'll cover 2 different markets. But for us, we do find that it's more often than not the whiskey fans, because I think if you go up to a car enthusiast and you say, do you want to buy this whiskey for £100,000 or $100,000, it seems a lot of money if you're not used to what the price point in whiskey normally is. Because I mean, for a whiskey fan, 100,000 is not I mean, it's not an enormous amount, really.
I know,
these days.
and I'm actually struggling to get my head around it because I it's not a market that I'm into. Peter's almost certainly never spent more than 30 quid on a bottle of whiskey.
No, but others have for me. But the point, not you. But I think the point is though, when you do put that into context with wine, for example, I mean, it's very easy to go to a restaurant and spend, I wouldn't do this, but £1,000 on a bottle of wine, even £10,000 on a bottle of wine, and the drinkability and the length of time that's in the bottle and stays on the table or on the cabinet is very different to whiskey. So over a period of time, the enjoyment that at least bang for the buck, I guess, is a bit stronger with
whiskey. When
whiskey.
did you last go to Pizza Express and see a bottle of wine for £10,000? We're in different places. That's what
I think what's interesting though, Johnny, is when you we talk a lot between watches, even art, and the other sort of connected categories that we have between the RM Sotheby's side of the business and the main auction business Sotheby's. And it's about storytelling, and as you say, with that sort of combination of the Aston Martin DB5 piston and the glass, it's creating stories for people, and I think that's as much about the heritage of the whiskey, the process. I'm sure you'll be telling us lots about all of that, but you are building those lovely connections that people can recount and enjoy telling.
I think there's also, especially in whiskey, there's the home of whiskey, i.e. Scotland, and particularly the distillery homes, dotted around, normally in pretty, remote places in the country. It's all about trying to, have people have a sense of place with the whiskey. And so I think if you have a brand association, it helps you just tie it to another place. So if it's Aston, it becomes quintessentially very British. Same with Macallan linked with Bentley, it becomes this quintessentially British product, and Glenturret and Jaguar. The other thing that Bowmore did very well actually was if you go to their distillery, so I mean a huge part of whiskey sales is the footfall you get through your distillery. If you go to Bowmore, they have a DB5 which is it's a one of one exclusive to Bowmore Distillery, and it has a place in the back that stores some whiskey. It's like a modded boot where you can store your bottles of whiskey. So if you go to the distillery, you can go and drive this car and have the roads on Isla are pretty good fun to drive. You can, rattle up and down the island, and then, when you're finished, go and park back up at the distillery and bring the whiskey out of the boot and have a dram, which is pretty cool.
After you've done the driving, not
you'd have to do it after.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point though, because I mean, if you go back, we were talking about Formula One sponsorship earlier, and the cigarette brands that are no longer allowed to be on mainstream TV and sponsor Formula One cars to discourage people from cigarette smoking. Has that not had a similar impact?
Johnny Walker's all over Mercedes. Well, it
was
all over
Mercedes. It was
It's
true in
interesting,
end of 2019, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting how the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authorities, haven't really paid that much attention. But I guess they are just brand associations. They're not saying, okay, we are promoting whiskey on the side of a brand new Aston Martin, but there's clearly a link and an association with drinking and driving.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I guess that particular association is probably it's a bit of a tightrope to walk, isn't it? Because you can't exactly promote drinking and driving together despite them being intrinsically linked in those products. There are certain rules about advertising for spirits. And I think they change from region to region. So it's quite hard to take something like the F1, which obviously exists all over the world, and say, you have to apply the blanket laws across every region that they go through. So I think it does get a little bit complicated. But we don't seem to have been so affected by the advertising, not the same way that cigarettes are.
And Johnny Walker's an interesting brand in so much, of course, that is the Rob Walker, very famous team owner. It was kind of garage owner, team owner, but is best known for running some fantastic and Formula One cars and sports cars, but very, very successfully. So he would, as a privateer, he would enter cars in Grand Prix and quite often beat the factory teams. And famously, he gave a lot of drives to Sterling Moss. So the whole Rob Walker motorsport thing is a big part of motorsport heritage.
Very distinctive and simple livery as well, weren't they, on the cars? The blue with the white nose,
blue with the white stripe
band around the nose.
And funnily enough, based in a town I know quite well called Dorking in Surrey, but all came from Johnny Walker family money.
Well, I think the messaging it's central as well. It's connoisseurship, isn't it? Ultimately, if you're a connoisseur of life from multiple different things, you drive a nice collectible car that you enjoy. You're the type of person, male or female, that we would like to be drinking our whiskey as well, and it's that association that comes with it. But I guess that's at one level, but the type of level we're talking about in the sort of whiskies that Sotheby's are selling is a whole different genre, because obviously there's a price point difference, but also I guess a much higher level of connoisseurship and understanding of the product and the process.
Yeah, and that tends to change depending on where in the world we are. So, I mean, interestingly, Paris, where we are now, we had our first ever auction in Paris of whiskey last year, and the average lot price was 80,000 euros, which gives you an idea of, that's kind of the realm in which we dwell when it comes to whiskey. And the connoisseurship, I think, it does change from place to place. In the US, people tend to favor a lower value whiskey in general. I think our average value of a lot in the US is about 4,000 USD. So it tends to be a lot more voluminous, and people are slightly less particular about what they collect. And as you travel east, it tends to, the value tends to increase.
And going back to the Aston Martin partnership, we had a discussion yesterday, didn't you? I mean, one of the Aston Martin bottles is 300,000 a bottle, is it?
So this is particular, because this is, I mean, much like your Bugatti over there, which is a one of one. This Aston Martin bottle that we're talking about, it's created by Bowmore. It's called the Arc, and there are around 100 what I would call standard bottles, which sit at around 100,000 price point. We have a one of one, so it's the same glass, but the liquid within it is unique, and then the cap on it is unique. It's kind of hard to describe to a podcast audience who are listening on audio, but I was saying to you yesterday, Peter, it looks kind of like if you sit in the cockpit of a Formula One car, the hood of, the back of the cockpit, the way it swoops back, it's this kind of shape. It's a sort of, it almost looks like a cycling helmet, the whole thing. There's a big cap on the top, and you need an Aston Martin key fob to release the magnet on the cap to get the bottle open. And so the cap that we have, it's this sort of wide metal lid. It's made, the standard one is made from stainless steel, our one is made from layered carbon, so it looks like a Japanese chef's knife.
Right.
It's been, they've been going through prototypes. We've actually had to move back the auction because Aston have been trying to produce this layered carbon for about a year now, and
is that right? So they're doing this at the Aston Martin factory, are they?
It's their, I think it's their engineering, but I'm not actually sure who produces it. So, but it's taken about a year to try and work out how to create this.
So there's going to be one bottle.
One bottle of this, and that's why you get the high price point.
And it's 300,000.
Yeah.
And the other thing that fascinates me, when you're in the car world, people buy collectible cars to drive, and absolutely there are people that will spend a lot of money on a car and they'll drive the wheels off it. There are others that choose to not drive them at all or very much, and they sit in collections and they will always have very low mileage. But whatever you've invested in the car, you've got the asset. It's always there. So a £300,000 bottle of whiskey, what's the chances somebody's going to drink that?
Good question. I think it really depends on the buyer. I would guess the chances of it being drunk are pretty slim. Although, I mean, I would say, so the most valuable bottle of whiskey in the world is the Macallan 1926. It's a 60-year-old bottle, originally released in 1986. There are various different versions of the bottle. I think there are 4 different labels. There's a 5th that is no one's ever seen. It was actually released as an unmarked bottle, just glass. So I don't know about this number 5, but there are 4 that we know of. We sold the most valuable one for 1.9 million USD back in 2019 for one bottle. And I do know a couple of these that have been opened. And
did you sell that in Olympia? Was that
it was at that was
yes.
the first time that we ever had. So it was in Olympia in front of the cars. And I remember because the sale went bananas and the bidding went on and on and on, and you guys were moving the cars onto the sides of the rostrum, and we were still just trying to hammer through the rest of the sale and get it done.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So that's still at auction. That's the most valuable bottle.
Yeah, that's still number 1, and I think it will be. There's one version of that bottle that could beat it, which is a Michael Dillon. It's a hand painted version of this bottle. It's it was another one that was just released as glass, and there was an Irish artist who painted onto it. And there are two others. There's a Peter Blake version, who's the pop artist who designed the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, and there's one designed by Valerio Adami, who's an Italian artist, which actually will be selling this year in the UK at some stage. But so, I mean, people do drink these, and if we sell this Adami, there is an Asian client who's interested in buying this to open. He's got another one, so if he gets the second one, he'll open it.
So I mean, in the car world, I guess there's no magic formula, but ultimately you're looking to achieve desirability, and to achieve desirability, you're looking at brand, you're looking at aesthetically pleasing qualities, usability, horsepower. There's a combat condition, rarity. There's a sort of magic combination of all of those things, and that shifts around. Particularly different eras of cars are fashionable for periods. What's in vogue, and also it's age related as well. I think there's certainly a sense, and we see it all the time in our marketplace, where people of a certain age remember the cars of their youth, and they're now making the money that they can afford them, so that prompts them to buy 70s and 80s Porsches, for example. But I mean, in your world, in the world of fine whiskey and rare whiskey, what is that sort of magic combo? I mean, how much is brand? You've talked about sort of design and packaging, which I guess it adds a certain amount of rarity and uniqueness. But in terms of brand versus quality versus drinkability, ultimately, and price.
And yes, and sorry to interrupt. The other thing is when you're a layman like me, and this is true of wine.
In many subjects.
In any subject, yeah, exactly. There's a perception that age is everything. So just because something is very old, that de facto it's valuable, and that's probably not the case either, is it?
I guess. Well, the question of if something is old, does it make it better? It is not necessarily the case, but more age and more value tends to be a pretty even.
Right. Is that just because it's rarer over? If it's 50 years old, there's just less of it
There's
around?
just less. Yeah, I mean, so there's less for two reasons. Firstly, I mean, most whiskies release at about 10 years old, let's say, for a single malt. So, let's say you make 1,000 barrels in a year, and you're going to take 800 of those barrels, and you're going to bottle them at 10 years old. You've only got 200 left, so you've got less that is old. And maybe you take another 100, you bottle them at 20 years old. You've only got 100 left, and very few barrels make it to being 50 or more. But then even within the barrel, you have evaporation occurring year on year. So you lose about 2% roughly of the volume of a barrel every year. So some barrels will never make it to 50 anyway, just because they'll be dead before they make it there.
Right.
So it's pretty rare. So you could have a 50-year-old whiskey that actually doesn't taste very pleasant, but it'll still be expensive just because it's unbelievly rare.
So age and rarity are kind of then in the same. Under the same.
I mean, and you're right. There is an equation of what's in vogue, what looks good, and that's the packaging, but also the color of the liquid. If the liquid looks really dark, people get kind of excited by it because it just means there's loads of wood interactions. There's going to be loads of flavor. How many have been made? How old is it? How many similar things have achieved that age from that distillery? And then the brand is probably the most important thing. So Macallan kind of leads the way. And then you've got Bowmore, Springbank, Dalmore, Glenfiddich, Balvenie, and a few others which really sit in the top end of the market. If these were all bottles of whiskey, it would be pretty much just those brands you'd see in this space.
It's really interesting. And just going back to the question of age, in the car world, we sponsor the London to Brighton Veteran Car Run, which is sort of not only the oldest motoring event in the world. And cars were only invented sort of in the 1880s. So there are very, very few of those cars. Super, super, super rare. The oldest cars in the world. They're actually comparatively not expensive versus the silver Aston Martin that's to my left here, which there aren't too many veteran cars dating from around 1900 that match the value of a car made in the mid 1960s. So it's weird, isn't it? I mean, age in the car world actually isn't an indication of value.
But also rarity is not always an indication of value. There used to be, if you've got a sort of purple spotted Volkswagen Beetle and they only made 2, it doesn't automatically make it valuable because not that many people wanted that particular version. And it's, the balance has to be that's where desirability comes out.
And a car that was made in 1900 is just not a very usable car.
Same with whiskey. It's probably not a very drinkable whiskey.
Well, that's the thing, and
Yeah.
that goes back to my question about who drinks and who chooses not to. So, because the risk of me as a perhaps only because I'm badly informed, but the risk of me going and paying a lot of money for a bottle of whiskey simply on the basis that it's old, to then take it home and decide on a special occasion that I'm going to open it, I could pour myself a glass of poison that really just is not drinkable at all, right?
Well, okay, so two things on this. Firstly, the age. So age is based on how long it's been in a barrel for, rather than how long ago it was distilled.
It's put in a barrel. Yeah,
so like the age. So let's say you distilled in 1900 and you bottled in 1915. It's a 15-year-old whiskey, and it will remain 15 years old. Even now, it's a 15-year-old whiskey. But But the old vintage, actually, the fact that it's been in a bottle for over 100 years is going to be detrimental, because you're going to see evaporation, and probably the quality of the liquid is going to be compromised at this stage. So that's one of the reasons that old whiskey actually doesn't tend to hold up. Another reason it doesn't tend to hold up is, in those days, blended whiskey was popular. Like Johnny Walker, Famous Grouse, Bell's, these names, that is the style that people used to favour. Single malt whiskey's only really existed since the 60s and properly since the 80s. It's actually a relatively new category, and that's pretty much where the collectible market is.
Okay.
And it tends to be more robust, and when it's bottled at high strength, it'll last a lot longer in the bottle. So, if you had a high strength single malt from 1915, distilled in 1900, it might be doing better now. It's sort of hard to say. I think the single malts will, they'll survive a lot better in the future. The other thing, I guess, most people have tasted, even if they haven't opened one of these bottles, before the release happens, there'll be an opportunity to taste most of these whiskies. So, I'm in an unfortunate enough position to have tasted a lot of rare stuff. So normally you can find someone's opinion on it before you open it. So you don't have to just take the plunge on a 50 grand bottle and open it and decide for yourself. You can find out whether or not it's
So when you say single malt has only really around 60 years, you watch the old movies from the 1950s, the first thing you do when you walk into someone's living room is you get poured a drink, don't you? And it's typically a scotch and water or something.
Yeah.
But prior to the single malts, were there collectible, valuable whiskies?
It didn't really, I guess, collectible only insofar as, it'd be more like collecting trinkets, just like these things weren't.
Right.
It wasn't about value increase, it was just about liking that thing and wanting lots of bottles. The value increase only really has existed probably in the last, only really in the last 15 years, I guess. Whiskey, even if you bought some of the whiskies we sell, here's a good example. There was a Curacao in 1960, it was released in 2012, I think, for £14,000 a bottle. And we sold one 2 years ago for £450,000. Which gives you an idea of where the market was and where it's gone since. In the last 10 years, it's just gone absolutely insane. So really, the idea of collecting whiskey, it existed in Italy, but it was more about enthusiasm, and now it's more about, how can you build something that will rise in value and will be the thing that everybody else wants.
Well, it's interesting because some of the big distilleries for a good few years now have been trying to make drinking, I guess, spirits in general, but Bacardi and things like the Bacardi brands and United Distillers, those big corporations, they've been pushing people and trying to make it more fashionable through advertising. I think it's quite unusual for a 25-year-old to walk into his local pub and order any sort of neat spirit, really. It's quite an unusual thing, but they've been making it sexy, aligning it with things like cigar smoking and tradition and connoisseurship in general. Do you think those campaigns, I guess, from the late 80s and the 90s have now sort of have a bit of a trickle-down effect or an upward effect, I guess?
I think the thing actually that's made more of an effect is, at the same time, there were back-to-back shows like Mad Men and Boardwalk Empire. I think that it was more about this sort of throwback culture, like TV culture that seemed to inspire it.
And it's opened people's eyes to it more than anything else. It's just sort of...
and Japanese whiskey was not popular until Lost in Translation. That did masses for the industry.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
so,
I do think the
what's
box
going
set
on
culture
in
was...
popular culture.
I have no data to back that up, but I do think it must have something to do with it, because around that time, it was, Don Draper was drinking whiskey and everyone suddenly started buying whiskey.
Well, it's no different to Aston Martin DB5s and James Bond and Amiga watches and things like that, is it?
No,
Really,
no.
ultimately, it's
Yeah.
come. I
Yeah.
think it's in a much more sort of in a conscience, much more widely, just because of popular culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. You just said if you were, you know, if we've got 100 cars around us, and they're all different makes and brands, and they've all multiple countries of origin, the whiskey market fundamentally comes down to 3 or 4 well-known brands that have all either come out of Scotland and Ireland. Is that pretty much it?
It's pretty much just Scotland.
Scotland,
Yeah,
okay.
secondary market, Ireland doesn't really play. Japan is way bigger, actually. Japan is...
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an idea of... So this is sort of an interesting representation of where the market is. The most valuable Scotch whisky is the Macallan 1926, which we sold at $1.9 million. The most valuable Japanese whiskey is a Yamazaki 55, which had, I mean, it's very expensive, but it had one freak result at around 800,000 USD in Hong Kong. And then the most valuable US whiskey we've ever sold is a Pappy 23, which also had a slightly freak result, but it was 53,000 USD. And you know, from 1.9 to 900 to 53, these are your top 3 categories, and that's how, you know, how much Scotch leads and how close behind Japanese is, and then the US is the beginning of the rest, and it's, you know, a fraction of the price.
Don't go Googling Yamazaki 55 and expecting a motorcycle to turn up.
I think I rode one when I was a teenager, to be honest.
Well, I'm curious, Johnny. In the world of cars, you've got obviously, from a collectible point of view, Ferrari still leads the way. Then you've got Lamborghini, Mercedes, Jaguar, Aston Martin, Bentley, etc., etc. And a lot of those brands have built their reputation, and I think Ferrari continues today to be in the status that it does, because they're still the only privateer team effectively running in Formula One and building fantastic road cars. You know, the Cavallino Rampanti, the brand, the image, the lifestyle that goes with it, the Italian enthusiasm and passion. You could probably sit and talk for an hour about what it is that's within the DNA of the Ferrari brand that makes it appealing today. In the case of whiskey brands, you know, you talk about Macallan, which is fantastic whiskey. What are the distinguishing factors? Is it just heritage, history, ownership?
Yeah, what makes
Macallan stand out among the other brands as being?
Well, I think there are 2 things mainly. Firstly, Macallan, well, actually 3 things. Firstly, Macallan released vintage statements quite early on. It was mainly because of the Italian market really wanted to have these vintage statements. So you can have what we call a vertical, which is when you have every year of Macallan, dating back really quite a long way. It also, point number 2, it didn't shut during the war, or at least not for very long, whereas most distilleries had to stop, and they became oil refineries or whatever else. You know, they used the production facility to make something to support the war effort. Macallan only had, I mean, it was like an 18-month period of closure or something.
Right.
So this vintage statement, it goes back so far, you can really collect, you know, way further back than you can with any other brand. And I think the third thing that makes Macallan valuable is it's easy to say. You know, there are so many distilleries that are hard to say, and Macallan it's Allen, which is just a name, and Mac, which is a very easy one-syllable word. And I think no matter where you are in the world, it's quite easy to say that word. Whereas there are other distilleries where, you know, even I struggle to say them. And that's going to be hard to globalize.
So it's not about the process, the barrels,
the quality. I mean,
they're kind of on a par.
Macallan's fantastic quality. There's no doubt about that. But it's not to say that there aren't other distilleries that are the same quality, or even that you could get Macallan distilled at Macallan, but bottled by another company. So, for instance, Gordon MacPhail bottle a lot of Macallan under their own label. It still says Macallan on it, but it'll say Gordon MacPhail.
Right.
And if you buy from Macallan direct or from Gordon and MacPhail, the price differentiation is massive. It's probably 10 times the price to buy what we call an original bottling Macallan rather than an independent bottling Macallan.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is driven, without wanting to underplay some of the sort of more subtle nuance, Macallan is a triumph of marketing.
Well, I think it is a triumph of marketing, particularly in, you know, this era of collecting that we're in now. But I think it's also, I mean, it was just fortuitous in terms of, you know, various different things that they did at Macallan, which it might not, they didn't anticipate the rise in the whiskey market.
I think the continuity is interesting there as well, Jonny. I mean, I didn't know that at all, and it's we see it in other brands. I think in particular in watch brands that have been relaunched in the last 20 years or 30 years, but have this huge gap in their history, and they look to their back catalogue. But there is this big gap. It's now new ownership, so there isn't that continuous history. So 1 year feeding the next, and that's really fascinating.
Sometimes that works to the benefit. So if Ardbeg, for instance, was shut for pretty much the whole of the 80s. So if you have 1970s Ardbeg, it's kind of old style Ardbeg, or if you have Port Ellen from before 1983, it's the old Port Ellen, and it's been shut ever since. So sometimes it does benefit the brand, but I think Macallan having that lineage, I mean, it does help. But the quality thing, of course, is important. There could be a brand with a lesser product than Macallan's, and it wouldn't do so well. And the style that Macallan has, they have very small stills, which are the copper pots that you do the distillation in, which tends to give you a very oily liquid. It's sort of viscous and unctuous, and they mature it in ex-sherry barrels with European oak, which tends to make it dark colour and very rich, sort of raisiny, dried fruity, and it's not smoky. So it's really approachable, very rich. It's luxurious, and I think that helps it, become the desirable product it is.
When you wake up in the morning with a raging hangover, you look rather unctuous. I think
Yes.
Good word. I like it.
Unctuous. Yeah.
So I'm curious. So within the world of auctions and I guess private sales as well, transactionally, is there much crossover between the typical buyer of wine, collector of wine, building great cellars, and whiskey, or has that evolved over the last 20 years?
Surprisingly, they're fairly distinct, actually.
Right.
I think most whiskey drinkers like wine, but not necessarily the other way around.
Yeah.
Whiskey's a little bit harder to approach, I suppose. So it's you find a lot of wine drinkers who just can't touch it. You actually find wine drinkers tend to gravitate more towards cognac or something like that than whiskey.
Yeah.
I think it's partly because they understand the product more. I mean, cognac is distilled wine and whiskey is distilled beer, essentially, which is why I think whiskey gets lumped into this sort of the boys' toys category of like cars and watches and stuff like that. Well, I do think there's a lot of crossover there, but it tends to be that wine drinkers, they don't always love whiskey.
Whiskey it's an interesting drink, and the point you just made, I think, is an interesting point, because it's very alcoholic, isn't it? You're pouring yourself a glass of very, very intensely alcoholic drink, and I suppose what I'm saying is it's an acquired taste, and you've got to learn it. And I've been lucky enough to do a couple of tastings with you, which have been really, really interesting. And yet, for me, it's still quite, I'll take a sip of something that you rate very highly, and I know it's not cheap to buy, and I'll sip it, and I've got that burning sensation going down the back of my throat, and I'm kind of thinking, blimey, I don't know if I can drink very much of that, and I'm not sure if I'm deriving much pleasure from it. Wine is almost instantly.
Talk to me, Jonny.
No. But I'm learning, and I'm keen to learn. But wine is very accessible. That's what I'm saying. It's quite. You just pour a glass of wine down your throat, and it's just easy to drink.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on all of that?
Yeah, so wine's sort of like diluted cognac, isn't it? It's just a bit, it's much easier to get on board with. It's, I guess that's part of what makes whiskey kind of interesting, is that it is quite alienating to begin with. And it's the same, when you drink, probably the first time you drank wine as well, it wasn't particularly nice.
Absolutely.
It's not delicious like Coke or hot chocolate or something.
Ribena.
Yeah, exactly. And so there is a barrier to entry where you've got to acclimatise, and that is something that I do recommend if you do a tasting, is to just have a little sip without, just sip, and all you need to worry about is the fact that it's going to be burning and taste of alcohol. And you just need to, get your nose and your palate used to that, and then you go back and you start tasting properly.
Yeah.
But there is a point where that alcohol burn, if it's not there, becomes quite disappointing. So if you get a bottle that's been, whiskey bottles are generally filled into the neck, and if you see one where the level has dropped significantly before it's been opened, so there's been a lot of evaporation. Normally the alcohol evaporates first, and you'll find that it's a little bit watery, a bit flabby, and it loses its structure, which becomes really disappointing. And also, I went to a whiskey festival in Berlin, I think it was, and I remember at the end of the day tasting this whiskey that was 43%, and most collectible whiskies tend to be, around 50 or even higher. And this 43% whiskey tasted so sort of kind of pathetic and
insipid.
In comparison. And there is a point where I think exactly. you find that the alcohol becomes a really important part of the, it's like spicy food. You kind of crave that hit.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, the effect of the alcohol is almost the worst bit about it, because I'd like to be able to drink more of it, but if you're dealing with, whiskies at 60%, you can only have one or two.
But it's also, I mean, I think as well though, it's romantic. It's a ritual. There's the glass that you use. There's the choice between water and ice. And I think it's also the approach. I mean, I've always drunk whiskey. But I've taken
it was mother's milk to you, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Always.
Well, in fact, I think one of the first things I drank as a very young child was a little dram of whiskey out of the lid of the bottle that my grandfather gave to me. And he said, he said to my mother, he won't want it when he's older. Yeah, how wrong you can be. But then a couple of times I've popped in, for a quiet drink on my own, and I've ordered a whiskey. Rather than having a glass of wine or something, and I've ordered a whiskey and ice on the side. Sorry, I quite like a cube of ice in it. And just sat there for half an hour and really sipped gently and enjoyed that. And that tiny little bit of liquid that can last half an hour, 40 minutes, and be a really, really enjoyable, rewarding experience. And I think there is a romance to that, as opposed to sort of coming away feeling slightly bloated and
it is nice to have something that you just don't have to have, like, quantity wise it's small, and also you can spend, I mean, we have whiskey sometimes when they're really special. You'll probably, before you've even tasted it, you'll spend 20 minutes just nosing it, which is where, I mean, that is most of the appreciation.
And that's what this is about. That's the commonality as well with watches. A lot of people like automatic watches, but there are a lot of collectors that actually still quite like manual wines or where you have to set the date. And it's the same, warming up your car, checking the oil and water before you go off on a drive, and polishing it. And when you uncover it or open the garage doors.
I've never checked the oil and water in my car. No. Which is why I get through a lot of cars.
That's why you get holes in your pistons. But you're such a distraction.
Sorry.
But anyway, I do think there is that ritualistic element to it as well, and that romantic, and it's slow living. All of these things, I come back to it so often. Vinyl music, it's not practical by any stretch of the imagination compared to just switching on your phone and having it playing in the background. But that engagement with listening to music, that engagement with the drink, and it's the same with wine to a degree. I know you quaff, as you've perfectly well described.
You sort of have to quaff with wine, though, don't you? Because you open the bottle and you've probably got a 48-hour window before it's done.
And he's got a 4-hour window before he's on the next.
Yeah, well, yes. There's no point hanging around with these things, Peter. No, but Josh Pullen, boss of Sotheby's Luxury, we did a recording with Josh in Geneva, and he made exactly that point. We were just touching on a few sort of asset classes, if you like, and we talked about whiskey and wine, and he made exactly that point in terms of drinking it. You can open a very valuable bottle of whiskey, and you're under that's something that you can enjoy over. Well, maybe you'll tell me. I mean, once you've opened it, how long have you got?
You've got a while. I mean, the thing that matters the most is what is in the bottle, what's the air to liquid ratio. So if you have a few sips and you introduce a bit more air into it, then it'll still last a while. By the time you get to about halfway down, you've probably got 4 months where it's still going to be good. If it's at the bottom, you're going to want to drink it quite quickly.
But in theory, you open a valuable bottle of whiskey and you can enjoy that over 3 to 4 months.
I mean, you've probably got a year going on it, really.
So that's amazing. So in a way, that does make the drinking experience pretty good value for money. Whereas the point that Josh made is you buy a very, very expensive bottle of wine, you pull the cork, you're committed.
Yeah, absolutely.
It needs to be done by tomorrow morning. So it's quite a different proposition, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the good thing about it. I mean, so you can also have loads of whiskey open, which means that stuff like whiskey tasting is very easy to do, because in my house at any time I've probably got about 200 open bottles. So
at home?
Yeah. So
good Lord.
Yeah, I know. So you can just on any day, if I want to think about if I want to drink a whiskey and just not think about it, I can do that. If I want to do some assessment and do some side-by-side comparison, I can do it. and it doesn't really affect, the bottles are open anyway, so you can just enjoy
But the
them
bottom
however you
line
want.
is you've got 200 bottles of whiskey to drink within a 3-month window.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, within it, yeah. That's
Interesting insight into your life there,
so,
John.
yes, some of these are definitely beyond their best.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we sort of maybe wrap up on this conversation, which has been brilliant.
I've got a question as well.
Okay, go
before
on.
you wrap up.
Well, no. Well,
He says.
Yeah, we'll come back to your question.
Thank you.
I saw an Instagram post recently where you were identifying a fake bottle of whiskey that I think was, in theory, quite a valuable bottle, and you recounted a story recently where somebody bought the most expensive sort of shot of whiskey ever served, and that wasn't exactly what the guy thought he was buying. So this opens up a kind of a whole can of worms. How much of a problem is that in the whiskey market? Because that is, for our audience listening to this podcast, this will resonate, because the faking of cars, the stamping of chassis numbers, fabricating an identity for a car, things not being as they should be. It is a problem. It's and you've got to be an expert. And we say to anyone, do your research. If you buy a car, know what you're buying. If you look at a number stamped on the chassis, really look at it. Don't just look at it once. Look at it 5 times. Is it right? Is there a chance that might not be original? So yeah, where's all that in the whiskey world?
Yeah, it is a problem in fake whiskey. It tends to be that vintage Macallans are where the fakes most commonly arise. There are some other things. Anything that was imported into
What's
Italy.
your point earlier? People can work out how to spell it, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Anything that was imported into Italy in a major way, that tends to be in about the 80s, that tends to be the highest risk part of the market. And we do come across fakes. I see them on, there are whiskey auctions the whole time, with our competitors, and I see them, pop up from time to time. We found one the other day. Well, when I say the other day, this was actually during lockdown. I found the videos on my phone, so I posted it on Instagram. It was in New York. I wasn't actually there, so I just had to do this by images. But I saw that there was a bottle that looked completely real. The back label looked slightly inconsistent from the front. It was a bit dirtier than the front, which was sort of unusual. And this was a Macallan Fine and Rare 1945, which is very valuable, probably over 50,000 USD per bottle. There was a slight crease in the capsule, which is unusual. So the Fine and Rare is probably the highest spec series from Macallan. And to have a crease on the capsule would be unusual because the QC was high on every element. So if it had a crease in the capsule, they'd probably recap it. So that's sort of strange. And then the labels looking a little bit different was kind of strange. So we looked at the color of the liquid. We happened to have a bottle that we'd recently sold, which we knew was genuine, that we could put side by side, and you saw that the liquid color was a little bit different. And then you were thinking, okay, there's 3 red flags here. The liquid color being the major red flag. Something's definitely wrong here. And there's a thing you can do with whiskey called beading, where if you take a high proof whiskey, this tends to be 50% plus, and it works particularly well with sherry matured whiskies. If you shake the bottles, you should find that there's a little head, like a foam, like a beer, basically, like the top of a beer will form once you shake the bottle. If you've got a 50% plus whiskey and you get no bubbles forming or they disappear immediately, then you probably
That's
got
a red flag.
Yeah, it's a big red flag.
Good.
Yeah, so we tested them side by side and we saw it, and it turns out this bottle was actually a dummy bottle. So it was just a window display, the glass is real, the label is real, the capsule is real, but it wasn't produced for sale, it was produced for display. And someone had sold it as real. And so the back label, the reason it looked inconsistent was because someone had forged the back label, because the dummies never came.
The front label was original.
Front was original,
the back
yeah.
label
Even the
wasn't.
signatures are correct. Everything about it is correct.
Wow, that's...
It's a nice segue actually into the question I wanted to ask, which is just a little bit more on the topic of collecting, buying at auction. If someone's looking to invest, the percentage of people that you think are just pure investors and others that are connoisseurs. And also, I just want to ask a bit about the distinction between buying in the barrel and buying in the bottle, because obviously, a friend of mine actually invested in some barreled whiskey and then has actually done quite well out of the investment when it was bottled.
Is this because you drink by the barrel? You drink by the barrel, don't you?
Yeah, you just pop a straw in the top.
Exactly, yeah. One of those curly straws he's got from his childhood.
It's curly after the whiskey, that's for sure.
So buying in the barrel is a bit more like, with a bottle of wine, we talked about that whiskey, if it's bottled at 15 years old, even if it's distilled in 1900 and bottled in 1915, it remains 15 years old forever. Whereas with wine, you count how many years since the vintage it's been, and wine technically ages forever, in the bottle. Whiskey does bottle age, but we don't really use that as a selling tool. But with the barrel, if you buy a barrel, you do benefit from that,
It's always
year
going to
age
aging
increase.
every year.
Yeah, so you kind of, the whiskey market goes up in general. So you benefit from that, plus you benefit from the age in the barrel. And there tends to be an exponential price increase as whiskey ages. So, in terms of a place to put your money, it is quite good. The only thing I would advise is to be quite cautious about who you buy your barrels from, because, there are a lot of shady companies and a lot of people who, they've bought barrels that don't exist, because, you only get a transfer of a piece of paper or an email confirming. So
you don't get to go and drive it or stroke it.
Right, exactly, yes. So you've got to put quite a lot of trust in who you buy from.
Sure.
So I would do, a lot of research on who on who the company is you buy from.
All the indicators are that from a sort of just a pure cold-blooded investment point of view, it's continues to be performing very well.
Whiskey's great as an investment, but I guess the issue is, and I don't know if this is the same with cars, because if someone doesn't drive a car, I don't know if it's bad for the car industry. But if someone doesn't, if let's say I produce 100 bottles of whiskey, I sell all 100, and everyone who buys is only in it for investment, no bottles get drunk. Then how do you introduce the rarity in the market? If you got 100 cars and someone 5 of them got crashed and they were written off, those you've only got 95 left, and it becomes rare. And you kind of need, I think whiskey needs to be drunk, and you need people who are willing to pull the corks. It's annoying because it is destructive, but you do require that element to keep introducing rarity. And I think prices will go up regardless, because, as something that's really only existed as a collectible category for the last, 20 years, we're getting more and more eyes on the product all the time, and more interested buyers. So just by the virtue of the fact of it's expanding, it goes up in
Cars
value.
rarely get destroyed, obviously. So if you've got a particular make or model of car and it was made between 1963 and 1967, whatever that pool of cars is, whatever that number is, give or take, it's always going to remain the same. I suppose you obviously very, very limited edition cars where there may be just 15 examples or 20 examples. The car market is so developed that in such a way that those 20 cars, they're all in private collections, and they kind of stay there, and they can stay there for very long periods of time. So when one of those 20 comes onto the market, that's a really great opportunity for another collector, and the prices are going up. And I suppose because the whiskey market is perhaps less mature, as those rare whiskies go into private collections, they kind of, if they stay in those collections, they don't get consumed. It's still, when they do appear on the market, you're still going to see an appreciation of or in the value, because and perhaps the opportunities to acquire them are simply just going to become less and less and less. Now people are seeing them as an asset class rather than.
You can also clearly define the rarity of the product. We know how many DB5s we built. We know how many of a particular blend of whiskey has been produced. But I think what's interesting is our job in creating aspiration and greater demand. So 100 people chasing 20 bottles is one thing. 1,000 people chasing 20. There's a relative.
Exactly.
And I think that's where the challenge and the interest comes. The suppliers are going to produce X amount, but if we can continue to do our jobs of increasing that demand, then relatively they seem rarer anyway.
And I think that's what's happening with whiskey. I mean, the demand increase is big. I think that my only concern is that the demand increase is driven partly by people who love whiskey, partly by people who love money. And there's sort of a dispassionate approach to collecting purely for financial interest that
exactly the same in the car.
Yeah,
world.
it doesn't benefit the industry particularly. Although, you know, I have an interest in whiskey prices going up because it's good for my job and, you know, good for my own collection. But I would prefer for people to collect with a genuine interest in the product, if possible.
It's the same, as you say, with cars. I mean, invariably we try to promote the cars that we're selling with a purpose in mind. So if you're buying that car, you want to do a concours of elegance, you want to go racing, and even, you know, we're selling this ex-Jean Ferrari Formula One from 1991.
Yeah.
Partially what's driving demand for those cars is usability and the race meetings that you can enter and go drive them on the track. Sitting in a collection is wonderful and you can sip your whiskey and enjoy it, looking at it, but if you know you can drive it as well and drive it competitively with like-minded people, it creates a wider, broader audience, I think.
I guess that's the sort of the thing with whiskey or wine as well, is that it'd be like driving the car but knowing that you only get to drive it the once.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Or it'd be like looking at a Damon Hirst and knowing that you can appreciate that with your eyes, but you've got to eat it at the end.
Yeah, burn it. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting. He destroyed a load of his. He created some art, didn't he? And you could either buy the NFT or the physical artwork. And if the NFT was purchased, he destroyed the original artwork. I was going to ask you a question, super basic question actually, but it interests me. I bought a bottle of whiskey, there might be 20 known bottles. I've got one of those 20 and I don't know where the other 19 are. How do I know that 5 of them have been consumed? I don't know. I mean, if you've got a bottle and you've drunk it and, you know, tossed the bottle away.
Yeah.
Because my bottle's suddenly gone up in value, but I'm blissfully unaware. How do you, as the whiskey expert at Sotheby's, know where the quantities lie?
So sometimes, I mean, it wouldn't be unusual for if you did drink one of them, or if someone did drink one of those 20, that they'd plaster it all over the internet and everyone would be well aware that they'd done it. But also there's just a regularity with which, you know, you say, like, if stuff goes in a collection and doesn't reappear for a long time, then the price goes up. If nothing gets consumed, then things, you know, reappear in the secondary market with more regularity. I guess you can just assume that some have disappeared for good. If, you know, let's say you see the same bottle numbers turn up again and again, but you don't see, you know, bottle number 2 and 12 and 18, then, you know, perhaps these ones have been, you know, been consumed and disappeared. So you don't necessarily know, but it's just about the perceived regularity with which they reappear on the market.
So there's no sort of register of bottles of...
there are some schemes in which you can, if you open your bottle, you can register it as an open bottle.
Right.
But it tends to actually be for lower value bottles. You know, things that, like a really, what we call flippable price point is around the £200 mark. You can buy it at 200 and you can sell it 400 often within 3 days. So people really try and encourage opening of those bottles, and there's a company in Edinburgh that does it's some reward scheme for opening your bottle, and because we do need to introduce some incentive for people to actually drink. I mean, particularly at that price point.
I love that.
Yeah.
Incentive
to drink. Yeah, exactly. It's a good drinking game. Yeah, especially at that price point. You know, if they release 3,000 bottles and they just keep getting flipped every month, you tire the market pretty quickly. And we're seeing a bit of market fatigue at the moment on that kind of stuff. This is the way people collect, is they go, oh, that whiskey, I like that, I'll have 100 bottles. So we see lists and it's 100 bottles of 10 different whiskies. You know, and they say, I've got $1 million collection. You're like, you do, but the exit on this is going to be nearly impossible. And this is what we're seeing a lot of in the US, where it's just unbelievable volume of bottles and people collecting for, you know, just to hoard rather than to be specific about what they want.
I've got a last question. Why screw tops for whiskey and not corks?
That's more of a...
I mean, I know we've seen it in wine as well, but...
Yeah, it's more for blended whiskey, actually. In Japan, they use plastic screw tops. Scotland, for blended whiskey, use metal screw tops, but we tend to use stopper corks, which is it's a cork with a plastic topper on it for a single malt. Okay. So it is cork more often than not, but actually cork's not...
That was probably a stupid question, wasn't it?
A little bit, but you can edit it. It's fine.
You can chop it out.
Don't be embarrassed.
No, I'm not embarrassed. You know, I'm not embarrassed. But I'm now rethinking the original question.
Your bottle of Teachers that you have in your pocket when you go to a rugby match is not the same as what we're talking about.
No,
here.
I know.
I have a question. You said about, like, some cars come with regularity, or things get popular and then that popularity peaks and wanes. What's popular right now for cars? What do you
Ferrari
see?
F40, for
Ferrari
example.
F40.
I mean,
Is that not like a timeless classic? Is that not just always in vogue?
It is, and I mean, many would say it was possibly undervalued for quite a long time relative to other similar models that of the same performance and quality, but they made quite a lot of them.
Yeah.
And then in what was really Monterey, US last year, there seemed to be a sudden surge in interest, and they kind of doubled in value over a very short space of time. But now everyone that owns one feels that the market's ripe and it's time to sell.
Get rid of it,
but there are, like everything else, I suppose what's quite different, if you've got 20 bottles of whiskey that have been produced or bottled out of the same barrel, they're all going to be the same, more or less, unless they've been mistreated or something.
Yeah.
You can have 20 Ferrari F40s and they're all different. Every history is different. Some will have more mileage, some will have been restored, some won't have been restored. You know, they've been better maintained.
Yeah.
So each of those 20 cars, each one has its own unique provenance, quality and saleability.
And does the price depend largely on condition and mileage? Is that?
I mean, mileage on modern supercars is important. I mean, modern anything built from the sort of 2000s onwards, people are looking at mileage. I think mileage, frankly speaking, on anything over that age is very difficult to prove anyway. It's just about...
Do you think people will take the clocks back on those? Or?
There was a time...
On a modern supercar, that's very hard to do because it's all, highly sophisticated electronics.
I mean, a few years ago, if you did a full restoration Aston Martin DB5, they would zero the mileage because the car is as good as new. And it wasn't frowned upon because you didn't try to prove it. I think something I'd say one of the things that's driving the market more than it has in some time is colours. The colour combination, and if that was a rare colour combination when it left the factory, and it still has that rare colour combination, I think that's fueling a little bit of extra interest in certain models. Don't you think, rarity of colours?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was in packaging, I think, in wine and whiskey and spirits is really interesting. And I'm by no means an expert, but I remember when the New World wines started to become popular, what would we say that 20, 30 years ago, Australia, New Zealand, the American wine producers, where they really made hay is that they were bringing bottles, traditional French vineyards have produced, very conservative labels. No bottle really stands out from a shelf, on a shelf, and the New World producers they seized the opportunity to put unusual or different labels and when your eyes are scanning, if you don't know very much about wine and you're just looking for something that catches your eye and you think, well, that would be nice as a gift, your eyes are drawn to the packaging. I mean, the thing is, you can't get sucked in by the packaging, can you? Because that's a really stupid thing to do. It's like buying a watch because it comes in a nice box, which is a ridiculous way to buy anything. So, but packaging plays a part.
I guess it is part of it though, because especially depending on how well you know whiskey, it's all about the process of appreciation. So if you have a bottle that looks cool, and maybe the liquid inside matters less to you because you're less in tune with what you might be drinking, then the packaging probably does mean quite a lot. Yeah. I mean, interestingly, they say you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but I found out that in France, the secondary market for books is based largely on the condition of the cover. So I think it does sort of, it's different strokes for different folks. If you like the look of it.
It's quite interesting, coming back to the point about colour with cars, because I think we've found vibrant, quite bright colours have been more popular in recent years. Colours like Riviera blue on a Porsche. It's a very vibrant blue, but it's quite a rare colour. And I was reading, dipping in and out of, in fact, Breakfast at Sotheby's, the book by Philip Hook, and he has this whole section on colour and what's saleable in the art world, particularly with reference to Impressionist art and paintings. And he was talking about, the fact that so many of those Impressionist artists spent their time in the Mediterranean, in the south of France, painting vibrant colours, whereas the British artists and British taste was much more earthy, sort of more muddy colours, and that was just based on the environment. And they were finding at Sotheby's and in the art world in general that it was the vibrancy of the colour which was appealing. If you can have two works of art by Matisse, for example, and one's got lovely, bright, fresh, strong, bold colours, and another is perhaps a little bit more muted,
brown,
that one's going to win out
yeah.
every time, which is really interesting. I guess it's that trend has probably found its way into cars to a point, I would say.
It's interesting.
Well, 70s colours, browns, and even I'm contradicting myself now, but 70s colours seem to be quite fashionable as well.
Yeah, there's definitely. I mean, I think this is also the throwback appeal of now. I'm pretty sure that's one of the reasons that whiskey's popular, because it's just people like that, an old school aesthetic, and I think having a bottle of whiskey on your, on your table or on your bar card or whatever, it seems to, it gives you that classic gentleman sort of style.
Yeah.
And it does tend to be as well. People ask a lot about, because it is the boys' toys and gentleman style thing. Do women collect whiskey? And sadly, we've found not really at this stage.
Just via drunken husbands.
Well, it does. I mean, women actually really lead the way in producing whiskey. Most of the best distillers currently are women.
Really?
But it's not trickled down into the secondary market yet. We've got about 2 big female clients, and there was a huge sale last year, not by us, but by Ardbeg, where it was a female client who bought. It's the most expensive barrel of whiskey ever sold. But it's pretty unusual. It still tends to be this. It's a gentleman's drink. But for younger gentlemen now, the sort of 30s and 40s tends to be your primary collecting age groups.
So, a final plug then for for the Sotheby's whiskey world. What's the next big auction that you've got coming up?
We have auctions pretty regularly. We had 20 in 2022. We'll have a similar number this year, so they tend to be fairly regular. The big things we've got coming up are a Yamazaki 50-year-old in Hong Kong. This was the first release of Yamazaki 50. It was the first Japanese whiskey to hit 50 years old. And I think the estimates are around 450,000 USD to 650,000 for that one bottle.
Wow.
Which will be pretty special. And we're doing it as a one lot only sale, so it's just the one bottle in the auction. And then we have a Macallan 1926 Adami, which is the most valuable whiskey bottle of all time. We'll be selling that in the UK, which again is going to be pretty cool. And then we have our Bowmore Aston Martin Arc 1 of 1, the exclusive, only one in the world bottle that'll be going on sale. It's hard to say, but probably in around the summertime.
Okay.
So those are the big things coming up for
Cool.
us.
Well,
Better sell a car, hadn't you?
I've sold a house. Honestly. That's been brilliant. Thank you, Johnny.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Really enjoyed the chat. So thank you for joining us for this latest episode of the Car Show, Cars / Whiskey, this episode, but I hope you found that as interesting as I did, because I knew absolutely nothing about whiskey, and I've learnt more in the last hour than I have in the previous 40 years. So it's been great. Thank you to Jonny Fowle, Head of Whiskey for Sotheby's. Thank you to Peter Warman, sitting right next to me, our chairman, for joining us in this conversation, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.